This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapters from My Autobiography by Mark Twain, Chapter 1, from North American Review, September 7, 1906. Prefatory note. Mr. Clemens began to write his autobiography many years ago, and he continues to add to it day by day. It was his original intention to permit no publication of his memoirs until after his death. But after leaving Pier number 70, he concluded that a considerable portion might now suitably be given to the public. It is that portion, garnered from the 250,000 of words already written, which will appear in this review during the coming year. No part of the autobiography will be published in book form during the lifetime of the author. Editor N.A.R. Introduction. I intend that this autobiography shall become a model for all future autobiographies when it is published after my death, and I also intend that it shall be read and admired a good many centuries because of its form and method, a form and method whereby the past and the present are constantly brought face to face, resulting in contrasts which newly fire up the interest all along, like contact of flint and steel. Moreover, this autobiography of mine does not select from my life its showy episodes, but deals mainly in the common experiences which go to make up the life of the average human being, because these episodes are of a sort which he is familiar with in his own life, and in which he sees his own life reflected and set down in print. The usual conventional autobiographer seems to particularly hunt out those occasions in his career when he came into contact with celebrated persons, whereas his contacts with the uncelebrated were just as interesting to him and would be to his reader, and were vastly more numerous than his collisions with the famous. Howells was here yesterday afternoon, and I told him the whole scheme of this autobiography and its apparently systemless system, only apparently systemless, for it is not really that. It is a deliberate system, and the law of the system is that I shall talk about the matter which for the moment interests me, and cast it aside and talk about something else the moment its interest for me is exhausted. It is a system which follows no charted course, and is not going to follow any such course. It is a system which is a complete and purposed jumble, a course which begins nowhere, follows no specified route, and can never reach an end while I am alive, for the reason that if I should talk to the stenographer 2 hours a day for 100 years, I should still never be able to set down a 10th part of the things which have interested me in my lifetime. I told Howells that this autobiography of mine would live a couple thousand years without any effort, and would then take a fresh start and live the rest of the time. He said he believed it would, and asked me if I meant to make a library of it. I said that that was my design, but that if I should live long enough, the set of volumes could not be contained merely in a city, it would require a state, and that there would not be any multi-billionaire alive, perhaps, at any time during its existence, who would be able to buy a full set, except on the installment plan. Howells applauded, and was full of praises and endorsement, which was wise in him and judicious. If he had manifested a different spirit, I would have thrown him out the window. I like criticism, but it must be my way. Number 1. Back of the Virginia Clemenses is a dim procession of ancestors stretching back to Noah's time. According to tradition, some of them were pirates and slavers in Elizabeth's time, but this is no discredit to them, for so were Drake and Hawkins and the others. It was a respectable trade then, and monarchs were partners in it. In my time I have had desires to be a pirate myself. The reader, if he will look deep down in his secret heart, will find, but never mind what he will find there. I am not writing his autobiography, but mine. Later, according to tradition, one of the processions was ambassador to Spain in the time of James I, or of Charles I, and married there and sent down a strain of Spanish blood to warm us up. Also, according to tradition, this one or another, Geoffrey Clement by name, helped to sentence Charles to death. I have not examined into these traditions myself, partly because I was indolent, and partly because I was so busy polishing up this end of the line and trying to make it showy. But the other Clemenses claim that they have made the examination and that it stood the test. Therefore I have always taken for granted that I did help Charles out of his troubles by ancestral proxy. My instincts have persuaded me too. Whenever we have a strong and persistent and ineradicable instinct, we may be sure that it is not original with us, but inherited from away back, and hardened and perfected by the petrifying influence of time. Now I have been always and unchangingly bitter against Charles, and I am quite certain that this feeling trickled down to me through the veins of my forebears from the heart of that judge, for it is not my disposition to be bitter against people on my own personal account. I am not bitter against Jeffreys. I ought to be, but I am not. It indicates that my ancestors of James II's time were indifferent to him. I do not know why. I never could make it out. But that is what it indicates. And I have always felt friendly towards Satan. Of course, that is ancestral. It must be in the blood, for I could not have originated it. And so, by the testimony of instinct, backed by the assertions of Clemenses who said they had examined the records, I have always been obliged to believe that Geoffrey Clement, the martyr-maker, was an ancestor of mine, and to regard him with favor, and, in fact, pride. This has not had a good effect upon me, for it has made me vain, and that is a fault. It has made me set myself above people who were less fortunate in their ancestry than I, and has moved me to take them down a peg, upon occasion, and say things to them which hurt them before company. A case of the kind happened in Berlin several years ago. William Walter Phelps was our minister at the Emperor's court then, and one evening he had me to dinner to meet Count S., a cabinet minister. This nobleman was of long and illustrious descent. Of course, I wanted to let out the fact that I had some ancestors, too. But I did not want to pull them out of their graves by the ears, and I never could seem to get the chance to work them in a way that would look sufficiently casual. I suppose Phelps was in the same difficulty. In fact, he looked distraught now and then, just as a person looks who wants to uncover an ancestor purely by accident, and cannot think of a way that will seem accidental enough. But at last, after dinner, he made a try. He took us about his drawing-room, showing us the pictures, and finally stopped before a rude and ancient engraving. It was a picture of the court that tried Charles I. There was a pyramid of judges in Puritan slouch hats, and below them 3 bareheaded secretaries seated at a table. Mr. Phelps put his finger upon one of the 3 and said with exulting indifference, "An ancestor of mine." I put my finger on a judge and retorted with scathing languidness, "Ancestor of mine, but it is a small matter. I have others." It was not noble in me to do it. I have always regretted it since. But it landed him. I wonder how he felt. However, it made no difference in our friendship, which shows that he was fine and high, notwithstanding the humbleness of his origin. And it was also credible in me, too, that I could overlook it. I made no change in my bearing toward him, but always treated him as an equal. But it was a hard night for me in one way. Mr. Phelps thought I was the guest of honor, and so did Count S. But I didn't, for there was nothing in my invitation to indicate it. It was just a friendly offhand note on a card. By the time dinner was announced, Phelps was himself in a state of doubt. Something had to be done, and it was not a handy time for explanations. He tried to get me to go out with him, but I held back. Then he tried S., and he also declined. There was another guest, but there was no trouble about him. We finally went out in a pile. There was a decorous plunge for seats, and I got the one at Mr. Phelps' left. The Count captured the one facing Phelps, and the other guest had to take the place of honor, since he could not help himself. We returned to the drawing-room in the original disorder. I had new shoes on, and they were tight. At 11 I was privately crying. I couldn't help it, the pain was so cruel. Conversation had been dead for an hour. S. had been due at the bedside of a dying official ever since 9:30. At last we all rose by one blessed impulse and went down to the street door without explanations, in a pile, and no precedence, and so parted. The evening had its defects. Still, I got my ancestor in, and was satisfied. Among the Virginian Clemenses were Jerry, already mentioned, and Sherrard. Jerry Clemens had a wide reputation as a good pistol shot, and once it enabled him to get on the friendly side of some drummers when they wouldn't have paid any attention to mere smooth words and arguments. He was out stumping the state at the time. The drummers were grouped in front of the stand, and had been hired by the opposition to drum while he made his speech. When he was ready to begin, he got out his revolver and laid it before him, and said in his soft, silky way, "I do not wish to hurt anybody, and shall try not to, but I have got just a bullet apiece for those 6 drums, and if you should want to play on them, don't stand behind them." Sherrard Clemens was a Republican congressman from West Virginia in the war days, and then went out to St. Louis, where the James Clemens branch lived, and still lives, and there he became a warm rebel. This was after the war. At the time that he was a Republican, I was a rebel, but by the time he became a rebel, I was become temporarily a Republican. The Clemenses have always done the best they could to keep the political balances level, no matter how much it might inconvenience them. I did not know what had become of Sherrard Clemens, but once I introduced Senator Hawley to a Republican mass meeting in New England, and then I got a bitter letter from Sherrard from St. Louis. He said that the Republicans of the North, no, the Mudailes of the North, had swept away the old aristocracy of the South with fire and sword, and it ill became me, an aristocrat by blood, to train with that kind of swine. Did I forget that I was a Lambton? That was a reference to my mother's side of the house. As I have already said, she was a Lambton. Lambton with a P, for some of the American Lambtons could not spell very well in early times, and so the name suffered at their hands. She was a native of Kentucky, and married my father in Lexington in 1823, when she was 20 years old and he 24. Neither of them had an overplus of property. She brought him 2 or 3 Negroes, but nothing else, I think. They removed to the remote and secluded village of Jamestown in the mountain solitudes of East Tennessee. There their first crop of children was born, but as I was of a later vintage, I do not remember anything about it. I was postponed to Missouri. Missouri was an unknown new state and needed attractions. I think that my eldest brother Orion, my sisters Pamela and Margaret, and my brother Benjamin were born in Jamestown. There may have been others, but as to that I am not sure. It was a great lift for that little village to have my parents come there. It was hoped that they would stay, so that it would become a city. It was supposed that they would stay, and so there was a boom. But by and by they went away, and prices went down, and it was many years before Jamestown got another start. I have written about Jamestown in The Gilded Age, a book of mine, but it was from hearsay, not from personal knowledge. My father left a fine estate behind him in the region round about Jamestown, 75,000 acres. Footnote, correction, 1906, it was above 100,000, it appears. When he died in 1847, he had owned it about 20 years. The taxes were almost nothing, $5 a year for the whole. And he had always paid them regularly and kept his title perfect. He had always said that the land would not become valuable in his time, but that it would be a commodious provision for his children some day. It contained coal, copper, iron, and timber, and he said that in the course of time railways would pierce to that region, and then the property would be property in fact as well as in name. It also produced a wild grape of a promising sort. He had sent some samples to Nicholas Longworth of Cincinnati to get his judgment upon them, and Mr. Longworth had said that they would make as good wine as his Catawbas. The land contained all these riches, and also oil, but my father did not know that, and of course in those early days he would have cared nothing about it if he had known it. The oil was not discovered until about 1895. I wish I had owned a couple of acres of the land now, in which case I would not be writing autobiographies for a living. My father's dying charge was, Cling to the land and wait. Let nothing beguile it away from you. My mother's favorite cousin, James Lambton, who figures in the Gilded Age as Colonel Sellers, always said of that land, and said it with blazing enthusiasm, too, "There's millions in it, millions." It is true that he always said that about everything, and was always mistaken, too, but this time he was right, which shows that a man who goes around with a prophecy gun ought never to get discouraged. If he will keep up his heart and fire at everything he sees, he is bound to hit something by and by. Many persons regarded Colonel Sellers as a fiction, an invention, an extravagant impossibility, and did me the honor to call him a creation. But they were mistaken. I merely put him on paper as he was. He was not a person who could be exaggerated. The incidents which looked most extravagant, both in the book and on the stage, were not inventions of mine, but were facts of his life, and I was present when they were developed. John T. Raymond's audiences used to come near to dying with laughter over the turnip-eating scene, but extravagant as the scene was, it was faithful to the facts, in all its absurd details. The thing happened in Lambton's own house, and I was present. In fact, I was myself the guest who ate the turnips. In the hands of a great actor, that piteous scene would have dimmed any manly spectator's eyes with tears, and racked his ribs apart with laughter at the same time. But Raymond was great in humorous portrayal only. In that he was superb, he was wonderful, in a word, great. In all things else, he was a pygmy of the pygmies. The real Colonel Sellers, as I knew him in James Lambton, was a pathetic and beautiful spirit, a manly man, a straight and honorable man, a man with a big, foolish, unselfish heart in his bosom, a man born to be loved, and he was loved by all his friends, and by his family worshipped. It is the right word. To them he was but little less than a god. The real Colonel Sellers was never on the stage. Only half of him was there. Raymond could not play the other half of him. It was above his level. That half was made up of qualities of which Raymond was wholly destitute. For Raymond was not a manly man. He was not an honorable man, nor an honest one. He was empty and selfish and vulgar and ignorant and silly, and there was a vacancy in him where his heart should have been. There was only one man who could have played the whole of Colonel Sellers, and that was Frank Mayo. Footnote: Raymond was playing Colonel Sellers in 1876, and along there, about 20 years later, Mayo dramatized Pudd'nhead Wilson and played the title role delightfully. It is a world of surprises. They fall, too, where one is least expecting them. When I introduced Sellers into the book, Charles Dudley Warner, who was writing the story with me, proposed a change of Sellers' Christian name. 10 years before, in a remote corner of the West, he had come across a man named Eschol Sellers, and he thought that Eschol was just the right and fitting name for our Sellers, since it was odd and quaint and all that. I liked the idea, but I said that that man might turn up and object. But Warner said it couldn't happen, that he was doubtless dead by this time. A man with a name like that couldn't live long, and, be he dead or alive, we must have the name. It was exactly the right one, and we couldn't do without it. So the change was made. Warner's man was a farmer in a cheap and humble way. When the book had been out a week, a college-bred gentleman of courtly manners and ducal upholstery arrived in Hartford in a sultry state of mind and with a libel suit in his eye, and his name was Eschol Sellers. He had never heard of the other one, and had never been within 1,000 miles of him. This damaged aristocrat's program was quite definite and businesslike. The American Publishing Company must suppress the edition as far as printed, and change the name in the plates, or stand a suit for $10,000. He carried away the company's promise and many apologies, and we changed the name back to Colonel Mulberry Sellers in the plates. Apparently there is nothing that cannot happen. Even the existence of two unrelated men wearing the impossible name of Eschol Sellers is a possible thing. James Lambton floated all his days in a tinted mist of magnificent dreams, and died at last without seeing one of them realized. I saw him last in 1884, when it had been 26 years since I ate the basin of raw turnips and washed them down with a bucket of water in his house. He was become old and white-headed, but he entered to me in the same old breezy way of his earlier life, and he was all there yet, not a detail wanting, the happy light in his eye, the abounding hope in his heart, the persuasive tongue, the miracle-breeding imagination. They were all there, and before I could turn around he was polishing up his Aladdin's lamp and flashing the secret riches of the world before me. I said to myself, I did not overdraw him by a shade. I set him down as he was, and he is the same man today. Cable will recognize him. I asked him to excuse me a moment, and ran into the next room, which was Cable's. Cable and I were stumping the Union on a reading tour, and I said, I am going to leave your door open so that you can listen. There is a man in there who is interesting. I went back and asked Lampton what he was doing now, and he began to tell me of a small venture he had begun in New Mexico through his son. Only a little thing, a mere trifle, partly to amuse my leisure, partly to keep my capital from lying idle, but mainly to develop the boy. Develop the boy. Fortune's wheel is ever revolving. He may have to work for his living some day, as strange things have happened in this world. But it's only a little thing, a mere trifle, as I said. And so it was, as he began it. But under his deft hands it grew and blossomed and spread, oh, beyond imagination. At the end of half an hour he finished with a remark, uttered in an adorably languid manner. Yes, it is but a trifle, as things go nowadays, a bagatelle, but amusing. It passes the time. The boy thinks great things of it, but he is young, you know, and imaginative. Lacks the experience which comes of handling large affairs, and which temper the fancy and perfects the judgment. I suppose there's a couple of millions in it, possibly 3, but not more, I think. Still, for a boy, you know, just starting in life, it is not bad. I should not want him to make a fortune. Let that come later. It could turn his head, at his time of life, and in many ways be a damage to him. Then he said something about his having left his pocketbook lying on the table in the main drawing-room at home, and about it being after banking hours now, and I stopped him there and begged him to honor Cable and me by being our guest at the lecture, with as many friends as might be willing to do us the like honor. He accepted, and he thanked me as a prince might who had granted us a grace. The reason I stopped his speech about the tickets was because I saw that he was going to ask me to furnish them to him and let him pay next day, and I knew that if he made the debt he would pay it if he had to pawn his clothes. After a little further chat he shook hands heartily and affectionately, and took his leave. Cable put his head in at the door and said, "That was Colonel Sellers." Mark Twain. To be continued. End of Chapter 1. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, September 21, 1906, Chapters from My Autobiography, by Mark Twain, Chapter 2. My experiences as an author began early in 1867. I came to New York from San Francisco in the first month of that year, and presently Charles H. Webb, whom I had known in San Francisco as a reporter on the Bulletin and afterward editor of the Californian, suggested that I publish a volume of sketches. I had but a slender reputation to publish it on, but I was charmed and excited by the suggestion and quite willing to venture it if some industrious person would save me the trouble of gathering the sketches together. I was loath to do it myself, for from the beginning of my sojourn in this world there was a persistent vacancy in me where the industry ought to be. Ought to was is better, perhaps, though the most of the authorities differ as to this. Webb said I had some reputation in the Atlantic States, but I knew quite well that it must be of a very attenuated sort. What there was of it rested upon the story of the Jumping Frog, When Artemus Ward passed through California on a lecturing tour in 1865 or '66, I told him the Jumping Frog story in San Francisco, and he asked me to write it out and send it to his publisher, Carleton, in New York, to be used in padding out a small book which Artemus had prepared for the press, and which needed some more stuffing to make it big enough for the price which was to be charged for it. It reached Carleton in time, but he didn't think much of it, and was not willing to go to the typesetting expense of adding it to the book. He did not put it in the wastebasket, but made Henry Clapp a present of it, and Clapp used it to help out the funeral of his dying literary journal, the Saturday Press. The Jumping Frog appeared in the last number of that paper, was the most joyous feature of the obsequies, and was at once copied in the newspapers of America and England. It certainly had a wide celebrity, and it still had it at the time that I am speaking of, but I was aware that it was only the frog that was celebrated. It wasn't I. I was still an obscurity. Webb undertook to collate the sketches. He performed this office, then handed the result to me, and I went to Carleton's establishment with it. I approached a clerk, and he bent eagerly over the counter to inquire into my needs. But when he found that I had come to sell a book and not to buy one, his temperature fell 60 degrees, and the old gold entrenchments in the roof of my mouth contracted 3/4 of an inch, and my teeth fell out. I meekly asked the privilege of a word with Mr. Carleton, and was coldly informed that he was in his private office. Discouragements and difficulties followed, but after a while I got by the frontier and entered the Holy of Holies. Ah, now I remember how I managed it. Webb had made an appointment for me with Carleton. Otherwise I never would have gotten over that frontier. Carleton rose and said brusquely and aggressively, "Well, what can I do for you?" I reminded him that I was there by appointment to offer him my book for publication. He began to swell, and went on swelling and swelling until he had reached the dimensions of a god of about the 2nd or 3rd degree. Then the fountains of his great deep were broken up, and for 2 or 3 minutes I couldn't see him for the rain. It was words, only words, but they fell so densely that they darkened the atmosphere. Finally he made an imposing sweep with his right hand, which comprehended the whole room, and said, "Books! Look at those shelves. Every one of them is loaded with books that are waiting for publication. Do I want any more? Excuse me, I don't. Good morning." 21 years elapsed before I saw Carleton again. I was then sojourning with my family at the Schweitzerhof in Lucerne. He called on me, shook hands cordially, and said at once, without any preliminaries, "I am substantially an obscure person, but I have at least one distinction to my credit of such colossal dimensions that it entitles me to immortality. To wit, I refused a book of yours, and for this I stand without competitor as the prize ass of the 19th century." It was a most handsome apology, and I told him so, and said it was a long-delayed revenge, but was sweeter to me than any other that could be devised. That during the lapsed 21 years I had in fancy taken his life several times every year, and always in new and increasingly cruel and inhuman ways, but that now I was pacified, appeased, happy, even jubilant, and that thenceforth I should hold him my true and valued friend, and never kill him again. I reported my adventure to Webb, and he bravely said that not all the Carletons in the universe should defeat that book. He would publish it himself on a 10% royalty, and so he did. He brought it out in blue and gold, and made a very pretty little book of it. I think he named it "The Celebrated Jumping Frog of Calaveras County and Other Sketches." Price, $1.25. He made the plates and printed and bound the book through a job printing house, and published it through the American News Company. In June I sailed in the Quaker City excursion. I returned in November, and in Washington found a letter from Elisha Bliss of the American Publishing Company of Hartford, offering me 5% royalty on a book which should recount the adventures of the excursion. In lieu of the royalty, I was offered the alternative of $10,000 cash upon delivery of the manuscript. I consulted A.D. Richardson, and he said, "Take the royalty." I followed his advice and closed with Bliss. By my contract I was to deliver the manuscript in July of 1868. I wrote the book in San Francisco and delivered the manuscript within contract time. Bliss provided a multitude of illustrations for the book, and then stopped work on it. The contract date for the issue went by, and there was no explanation of this. Time drifted along, and still there was no explanation. I was lecturing all over the country, and about 30 times a day, on an average, I was trying to answer this conundrum: "When is your book coming out?" I got tired of inventing new answers to that question, and by I got horribly tired of the question itself. Whoever asked it became my enemy at once, and I was usually almost eager to make that appear. As soon as I was free of the lecture field, I hastened to Hartford to make inquiries. Bliss said that the fault was not his, that he wanted to publish the book, but the directors of his company were staid old fossils and were afraid of it. They had examined the book, and the majority of them were of the opinion that there were places in it of a humorous character. Bliss said the house had never published a book that had a suspicion like that attaching to it, and that the directors were afraid that a departure of this kind would seriously injure the house's reputation, that he was tied hand and foot, and was not permitted to carry out his contract. One of the directors, a Mr. Drake, at least he was the remains of what had once been a Mr. Drake, invited me to take a ride with him in his buggy, and I went along. He was a pathetic old relic, and his ways and his talk were also pathetic. He had a delicate purpose in view, and it took him some time to hearten himself sufficiently to carry it out, but at last he accomplished it. He explained the house's difficulty and distress as Bliss had already explained it. Then he frankly threw himself and the house upon my mercy, and begged me to take away the Innocents Abroad and release the concern from the contract. I said I wouldn't, and so ended the interview and the buggy excursion. Then I warned Bliss that he must get to work, or I should make trouble. He acted upon the warning, and set up the book, and I read the proofs. Then there was another long wait, and no explanation. At last, towards the end of July, 1869, I think, I lost patience and telegraphed Bliss that if the book was not on sale in 24 hours, I should bring suit for damages. That ended the trouble. Half a dozen copies were bound and placed on sale within the required time. Then the canvassing began, and went briskly forward. In 9 months the book took the publishing house out of debt, advanced its stock from 25 to 200, and left $70,000 profit to the good. It was Bliss that told me this, but if it was true, it was the first time that he had told the truth in 65 years. He was born in 1804. Number 3. This was in 1849. I was 14 years old then. We were still living in Hannibal, Missouri, on the banks of the Mississippi, in the new frame house built by my father 5 years before. That is, some of us lived in the new part, the rest in the old part back of it, the L. In the autumn my sister gave a party, and invited all the marriageable young people of the village. I was too young for this society, and was too bashful to mingle with young ladies anyway, therefore I was not invited, at least not for the whole evening. 10 minutes of it was to be my whole share. I was to do the part of a bear in a small fairy play. I was to be disguised all over in a close-fitting brown hairy stuff proper for a bear. About 10:30 I was told to go to my room and put on this disguise, and be ready in half an hour. I started, but changed my mind, for I wanted to practice a little, and that room was very small. I crossed over to the large unoccupied house on the corner of Main and Hill Streets. That house still stands, unaware that a dozen of the young people were also going there to dress for their parts. I took the little black slave boy, Sandy, with me, and we selected a roomy and empty chamber on the second floor. We entered it talking, and this gave a couple of half-dressed young ladies an opportunity to take refuge behind a screen undiscovered. Their gowns and things were hanging on hooks behind the door, but I did not see them. It was Sandy that shut the door, but all his heart was in the theatricals, and he was as unlikely to notice them as I was myself. That was a rickety screen with many holes in it, but as I did not know there were girls behind it, I was not disturbed by that detail. If I had known, I could not have undressed in the flood of cruel moonlight that was pouring in at the curtainless windows. I should have died of shame. Untroubled by apprehensions, I stripped to the skin and began my practice. I was full of ambition. I was determined to make a hit. I was burning to establish a reputation as a bear and get further engagements. So I threw myself into my work with an abandon that promised great things. I capered back and forth from one end of the room to the other on all fours, Sandy applauding with enthusiasm. I walked upright and growled and snapped and snarled. I stood on my head. I flung handsprings. I danced a lubberly dance with my paws bent and my imaginary snout sniffing from side to side. I did everything a bear could do, and many things which no bear could ever do, and no bear with any dignity would want to do anyway. And of course I never suspected that I was making a spectacle of myself to any one but Sandy. At last, standing on my head, I paused in that attitude to take a minute's rest. There was a moment's silence. Then Sandy spoke up with excited interest and said, "Marsam, has you ever seen a smoked herring?" "No. What is that?" "It's a fish." "Well, what of it? Anything peculiar about it?" "Yes, sir, you bet you dey is. Dey eats them, guts and all." There was a smothered burst of feminine snickers from behind the screen. All the strength went out of me, and I toppled forward like an undermined tower and brought the screen down with my weight, burying the young ladies under it. In their fright they discharged a couple of piercing screams, and possibly others, but I did not wait to count. I snatched my clothes and fled to the dark hall below, Sandy following. I was dressed in half a minute and out the back way. I swore Sandy to eternal silence, and then we went away and hid until the party was over. The ambition was all out of me. I could not have faced that giddy company after my adventure, for there would be 2 performers there who knew my secret, and would be privately laughing at me all the time. I was searched for, but not found, and the bear had to be played by a young gentleman in his civilized clothes. The house was still and everybody asleep when I finally ventured home. I was very heavy-hearted and full of a sense of disgrace. Pinned to my pillow I found a slip of paper which bore a line that did not lighten my heart but only made my face burn. It was written in a laboriously disguised hand, and these were its mocking terms: "You probably couldn't have played bear, but you played bear very well. Oh, very well. We think boys are rude, unsensitive animals, but it is not so in all cases. Each boy has 1 or 2 sensitive spots, and if you can find out where they are located, you have only to touch them and you can scorch him as if with fire. I suffered miserably over that episode. I expected that the facts would be all over the village in the morning, but it was not so. The secret remained confined to the 2 girls and Sandy and me. That was some appeasement of my pain, but it was far from sufficient. The main trouble remained. I was under 4 mocking eyes, and it might as well have been 1,000, for I suspected all girls' eyes of being the ones I so dreaded. During several weeks I could not look any young lady in the face. I dropped my eyes in confusion when any one of them smiled upon me and gave me greeting, and I said to myself, "That is one of them," and got quickly away. Of course I was meeting the right girls everywhere, but if they ever let slip any betraying sign I was not bright enough to catch it. When I left Hannibal 4 years later the secret was still a secret. I had never guessed those girls out, and was no longer expecting to do it, nor waiting to, either. One of the dearest and prettiest girls in the village at the time of my mishap was one whom I will call Mary Wilson, because that was not her name. She was 20 years old. She was dainty and sweet, peach-bloomy and exquisite, gracious and lovely in character, and I stood in awe of her, for she seemed to me to be made out of angel clay and rightfully unapproachable by any unholy ordinary kind of boy like me. I probably never suspected her, but the scene changes to Calcutta, 47 years later. It was in 1896. I arrived there on my lecturing trip. As I entered the hotel a divine vision passed out of it, clothed in the glory of the Indian sunshine, the Mary Wilson of my long-vanished boyhood. It was a startling thing. Before I could recover from the bewildering shock and speak to her, She was gone. I thought maybe I had seen an apparition, but it was not so. She was flesh. She was the granddaughter of the other Mary, the original Mary. That Mary, now a widow, was upstairs, and presently sent for me. She was old and gray-haired, but she looked young and was very handsome. We sat down and talked. We steeped our thirsty souls in the reviving wine of the past, the beautiful past, the dear and lamented past. We uttered the names that had been silent upon our lips for 50 years, and it was as if they were made of music. With reverent hands we unburied our dead, the mates of our youth, and caressed them with our speech. We searched the dusty chambers of our memories and dragged forth incident after incident, episode after episode, folly after folly, and laughed such good laughs over them, with the tears running down. And finally Mary suddenly, and without any leading up, "Tell me, what is the special peculiarity of smoked herrings?" It seemed a strange question at such a hallowed time as this, and so inconsequential, too. I was a little shocked. And yet I was aware of a stir of some kind away back in the deeps of my memory somewhere. It set me to musing, thinking, searching. Smoked herrings, the peculiarity of I glanced up. Her face was grave, but there was a dim and shadowy twinkle in her eye which, all of a sudden, I knew. And far away down in the hoary past I heard a remembered voice murmur, "Dey eats 'em guts and all." At last! I've found one of you, anyway. Who was the other girl? But she drew the line there. She wouldn't tell me. Number 4. But it was on a bench in Washington Square that I saw the most of Louis Stevenson. It was an outing that lasted an hour or more, and was very pleasant and sociable. I had come with him from his house, where I had been paying my respects to his family. His business in the square was to absorb the sunshine. He was most scantily furnished with flesh. His clothes seemed to fall into hollows, as if there might be nothing inside but the frame for a sculptor's statue. His long face and lank hair and dark complexion and musing and melancholy expression seemed to fit these details justly and harmoniously, and the altogether of it seemed especially planned to gather the rays of your observation and focalize them upon Stevenson's special distinction and commanding feature, his splendid eyes. They burned with a smoldering rich fire under the penthouse of his brows, and they made him beautiful. I said I thought he was right about the others, but mistaken as to Bret Harte. In substance, I said that Harte was good company, and a thin but pleasant talker, that he was always bright, but never brilliant, that in this matter he must not be classed with Thomas Bailey Aldrich, nor must any other man, ancient or modern, that Aldrich was always witty, always brilliant, if there was anybody present capable of striking his flint at the right angle, that Aldrich was as sure and prompt and unfailing as the red-hot iron on the blacksmith's anvil. You had only to hit it competently to make it deliver an explosion of sparks. I added, "Aldrich has never had his peer for prompt and pithy and witty and humorous sayings. None has equaled him, certainly none has surpassed him, in the felicity of phrasing with which he clothed these children of his fancy. Aldrich was always brilliant. He couldn't help it. He is a fire opal set round with rose diamonds. When he is not speaking, you know that his dainty fancies are twinkling and glimmering around in him. When he speaks, the diamonds flash. Yes, he was always brilliant. He will always be brilliant. He will be brilliant in hell. You will see." Stevenson smiling a chuckly smile. "I hope not." "Well, you will, and he will dim even those ruddy fires, and look like a transfigured Adonis backed against a pink sunset." There on that bench we struck out a new phrase, one or the other of us, I don't remember which. Submerged renown. Variations were discussed. Submerged fame, submerged reputation, and so on, and a choice was made. Submerged renown was elected, I believe. This important matter rose out of an incident which had been happening to Stevenson in Albany. While in a bookshop or bookstall there, he had noticed a long rank of small books, cheaply but neatly gotten up, and bearing such titles as Davis's Selected Speeches, Davis's Selected Poetry, Davis's This, and Davis's That, and Davis's The Other Thing. Compilations, every one of them, each with a brief, compact, intelligent, and useful introductory chapter by this same Davis, whose first name I have forgotten. Stevenson had begun the matter with this question: "Can you name the American author whose fame and acceptance stretch widest in the States?" I thought I could, but it did not seem to me that it would be modest to speak out in the circumstances, so I diffidently said nothing. Stevenson noticed, and said, "Save your delicacy for another time. You are not the one. For a shilling you can't name the American author of widest note and popularity in the States, but I can." Then he went on and told about that Albany incident. He had inquired of the shopman, "Who is this Davis?" The answer was, "An author whose books have to have freight trains to carry them, not baskets. Apparently you have not heard of him." Stevenson said no, this was the first time. The man said, "Nobody has heard of Davis. You may ask all around, and you will see. You never see his name mentioned in print, not even in advertisement. These things are of no use to Davis, not any more than they are to the wind and the sea. You never see one of Davis's books floating on top of the United States. But put on your diving armor and get yourself lowered away down and down and down till you strike the dense region, the sunless region of eternal drudgery and starvation wages. There you'll find them by the million. The man that gets that market, his fortune is made, his bread and butter are safe, for those people will never go back on him. An author may have a reputation which is confined to the surface, and lose it and become pitied, then despised, then forgotten, entirely forgotten, the frequent steps in a surface reputation. A surface reputation, however great, is always mortal, and always killable if you go at it right, with pins and needles and quiet slow poison, not with a club and tomahawk. But it is a different matter with the submerged reputation, down in the deep water. Once a favorite there, always a favorite. Once beloved, always beloved. Once respected, always respected, honored, and believed in. For what the reviewer says never finds its way down into those placid deeps, nor the newspaper sneers, nor any breath of the winds of slander blowing above. Down there they never hear of these things. Their idol may be painted clay up there at the surface, and fade and waste and crumble and blow away, there being much weather there. But down below he is gold and adamant and indestructible. Number 5. This is from this morning's paper. Mark Twain letter sold. Written to Thomas Nast, it proposed a joint tour. A Mark Twain autograph letter brought $43 yesterday at the auction by the Merwin Clayton Company of the Library and Correspondence of the late Thomas Nast, cartoonist. The letter is 9 pages, note paper, is dated Hartford, November 12, 1877, and is addressed to Nast. It reads in part as follows: Hartford, November 12. My dear Nast, I did not think I should ever stand on a platform again until the time was come for me to say I die innocent. But the same old offers keep arriving that have arriven every year, and been every year declined. $500 for Louisville, $500 for St. Louis, 1,000 gold for 2 nights in Toronto, half gross proceeds for New York, Boston, Brooklyn, etc. I have declined them all, just as usual, though sorely tempted, as usual. Now I do not decline because I mind talking to an audience, but because, 1. Traveling alone is so heart-breakingly dreary, and 2. Shouldering the whole show is such cheer-killing responsibility. Therefore I now propose to you what you proposed to me in November, 1867, 10 years ago, when I was unknown, viz., that you should stand on the platform and make pictures, and I stand by you and blackguard the audience. I should enormously enjoy meandering around to big towns, don't want to go to little ones, with you for company. The letter includes a schedule of cities and the number of appearances planned for each. This is as it should be. This is worthy of all praise. I say it myself, lest other competent persons should forget to do it. It appears that 4 of my ancient letters were sold at auction, 3 of them at $27, $28, and $29, respectively, and the one above mentioned at $43. There is one very gratifying circumstance about this, to wit, that my literature has more than held its own as regards money value through this stretch of 36 years. I judge that the $43 letter must have gone at about 10 cents a word, whereas if I had written it today, its market rate would be 30 cents, so I have increased in value 200 or 300%. I note another gratifying circumstance, that a letter of General Grant's sold at something short of $18. I can't rise to General Grant's lofty place in the estimation of this nation, but it is a deep happiness to me to know that when it comes to epistolary literature he can't sit in the front seat along with me. This reminds me, 9 years ago, when we were living in Tedworth Square, London, a report was cabled to the American journals that I was dying. I was not the one. It was another Clemens, a cousin of mine, Dr. J. Ross Clemens, now of St. Louis, who was due to die, but presently escaped by some chicanery or other characteristic of the tribe of Clemens. The London representatives of the American papers began to flock in, with American cables in their hands, to inquire into my condition. There was nothing the matter with me, and each in his turn was astonished and disappointed to find me reading and smoking in my study and worth next to nothing as a text for transatlantic news. One of these men was a gentle and kindly and grave and sympathetic Irishman who hid his sorrow the best he could and tried to look glad, and told me that his paper, the Evening Sun, had cabled him that it was reported in New York that I was dead. What should he cable in reply? I said, "Say the report is greatly exaggerated." He never smiled, but went solemnly away and sent the cable in those words. The remark hit the world pleasantly, and to this day it keeps turning up now and then in the newspapers when people have occasion to discount exaggerations. The next man was also an Irishman. He had his New York cablegram in his hand from the New York World, and he was so evidently trying to get around that cable with invented softnesses and palliations that my curiosity was aroused, and I wanted to see what it did really say. So when occasion offered, I slipped it out of his hand, and it said, "If Mark Twain dying, send 500 words. If dead, send 1,000. Now that old letter of mine sold yesterday for $43. When I am dead it will be worth 86. Mark Twain. To be continued. End of chapter 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, October 5, 1906, chapters from my autobiography, Chapter 3, by Mark Twain. 4. Tomorrow will be the 36th anniversary of our marriage. My wife passed from this life 1 year and 8 months ago in Florence, Italy, after an unbroken illness of 22 months' duration. I saw her first in the form of an ivory miniature in her brother Charlie's stateroom in the steamer Quaker City in the Bay of Smyrna in the summer of 1867, when she was in her 22nd year. I saw her in the flesh for the first time in New York in the following December. She was slender and beautiful and girlish, and she was both girl and woman. She remained both girl and woman to the last day of her life. Under a grave and gentle exterior burned inextinguishable fires of sympathy, energy, devotion, enthusiasm, and absolutely limitless affection. She was always frail in body, and she lived upon her spirit, whose hopefulness and courage were indestructible. Perfect truth, perfect honesty, perfect candor were qualities of her character which were born with her. Her judgments of people and things were sure and accurate. Her intuitions almost never deceived her. In her judgments of the characters and acts of both friends and strangers there was always room for charity, and this charity never failed. I have compared and contrasted her with hundreds of persons, and my conviction remains that hers was the most perfect character I have ever met. And I may add that she was the most winningly dignified person I have ever known. Her character and disposition were of the sort that not only invites worship, but commands it. No servant ever left her service who deserved to remain in it, and, as she could choose with a glance of her eye, the servants she selected did in almost all cases deserve to remain, and they did remain. She was always cheerful, and she was always able to communicate her cheerfulness to others. During the 9 years that we spent in poverty and debt, she was always able to reason me out of my despairs, and find a bright side to the clouds, and make me see it. In all that time I never knew her to utter a word of regret concerning our altered circumstances, nor did I ever know her children to do the like, for she had taught them, and they drew their fortitude from her. The love which she bestowed upon those whom she loved took the form of worship, and in that form it was returned by relatives, friends, and the servants of our household. It was a strange combination which wrought into one individual, so to speak, by marriage, her disposition and character and mine. She poured out her prodigal affections in kisses and caresses, and a vocabulary of endearments whose profusion was always an astonishment to me. I was born reserved as to endearments of speech and caresses, and hers broke upon me as the summer waves break upon Gibraltar. I was reared in that atmosphere of reserve. As I have already said in another chapter, I never knew a member of my father's family to kiss another member of it except once, and that at a deathbed. And our village was not a kissing community. The kissing and caressing ended with courtship, along with the deadly piano-playing of the day. She had the heart-free laugh of a girl. It came seldom, but when it broke upon the ear it was as inspiring as music. I heard it for the last time when she had been occupying her sick-bed for more than a year, and I made a written note of it at the time, a note not to be repeated. Tomorrow will be the 36th anniversary. We were married in her father's house in Elmira, New York, and went next day by special train to Buffalo, along with the whole Langdon family, and with the Beechers and the Twitchells, who had solemnized the marriage. We were to live in Buffalo, where I was to be one of the editors of the Buffalo Express, and a part owner of the paper. I knew nothing about Buffalo, but I had made my household arrangements there through a friend, by letter. I had instructed him to find a boarding-house of as respectable a character as my light salary as editor would command. We were received at about 9 o'clock at the station in Buffalo, and were put into several sleighs, and driven all over America, as it seemed to me, for apparently we turned all the corners in the town and followed all the streets there were, I scolding freely, and characterizing that friend of mine in very uncomplimentary words for securing a boarding-house that apparently had no definite locality. But there was a conspiracy, and my bride knew of it, but I was in ignorance. Her father, Jervis Langdon, had bought and furnished a new house for us in the fashionable street, Delaware Avenue, and had laid in a cook and housemaids, and a brisk and electric young coachman, an Irishman, Patrick McAleer, and we were being driven all over that city in order that one sleighful of those people could have time to go to the house and see that the gas was lighted all over it and a hot supper prepared for the crowd. We arrived at last, and when I entered that fairy place my indignation reached high-water mark, and without any reserve I delivered my opinion to that friend of mine for being so stupid as to put us up into a boarding-house whose terms would be far out of my reach. Then Mr. Langdon brought forward a very pretty box, and opened it, and took from it a deed of the house. So the comedy ended very pleasantly, and we sat down to dinner. The company departed about midnight, and left us alone in our new quarters. Then Ellen the cook came in to get orders for the morning's marketing, and neither of us knew whether beefsteak was sold by the barrel or by the yard. We exposed our ignorance, and Ellen was full of Irish delight over it. Patrick McAleer, that brisk young Irishman, came in to get his orders for next day, and that was our first glimpse of him. Our first child, Langdon Clemens, was born the 7th of November, 1870, and lived 22 months. Susie was born the 19th of March, 1872, and passed from life in the Hartford home the 18th of August, 1896. With her, when the end came, were Jean and Katie Leary and John and Ellen, the gardener and his wife. Clara and her mother and I arrived in England from around the world on the 31st of July and took a house in Guilford. A week later, when Susie, Katie, and Jean should have been arriving from America, we got a letter instead. It explained that Susie was slightly ill, nothing of consequence, but we were disquieted, and began to cable for later news. This was Friday. All day no answer, and the ship to leave Southampton next day at noon. Clara and her mother began packing, to be ready in case the news should be bad. Finally came a telegram saying, "Wait for cablegram in the morning." This was not satisfactory, not reassuring. I cabled again, asking that the answer be sent to Southampton, for the day was now closing. I waited in the post office that night till the doors were closed toward midnight, in the hope that good news might still come, but there was no message. We sat silent at home till 1 in the morning, waiting for we knew not what. Then we took the earliest morning train, and when we reached Southampton the message was there. It said the recovery would be long, but certain. This was a great relief to me, but not to my wife. She was frightened. She and Clara went aboard the steamer at once, and sailed for America to nurse Susie. I remained behind to search for a larger house in Guilford. That was the 15th of August, 1896. 3 days later, when my wife and Clara were about halfway across the ocean, I was standing in our dining room, thinking of nothing in particular, when a cablegram was put into my hand. It said, "Susie was peacefully released today." It is one of the mysteries of our nature that a man all unprepared can receive a thunderstroke like that and live. There is but one reasonable explanation of it. The intellect is stunned by the shock, and but gropingly gathers the meaning of the words. The power to realize their full import is mercifully wanting. The mind has a numb sense of vast loss. That is all. It will take mind and memory months and possibly years to gather together the details, and thus learn and know the whole extent of the loss. A man's house burns down. The smoking wreckage represents only a ruined home that was dear through years of use and pleasant associations. By and by, as the days and weeks go on, first he misses this, then that, then the other thing, and when he casts about for it he finds that it was in that house. Always it is an essential. There was but one of its kind. It cannot be replaced. It was in that house. It is irrevocably lost. He did not realize that it was an essential when he had it. He only discovers it now when he finds himself balked, hampered by its absence. It will be years before the tale of lost essentials is complete, and not till then can he truly know the magnitude of his disaster. The 18th of August brought me the awful tidings. The mother and the sister were out there in mid-Atlantic, ignorant of what was happening, flying to meet this incredible calamity. All that could be done to protect them from the full force of the shock was done by relatives and good friends. They went down the bay and met the ship at night, but did not show themselves until morning, and then only to Clara. When she returned to the stateroom she did not speak, and did not need to. Her mother looked at her and said, "Susie is dead." At 10:30 that night, Clara and her mother completed their circuit of the globe, and drew up at Elmira by the same train and in the same car which had borne them and me westward from it 1 year, 1 month, and 1 week before. And again Susie was there, not waving her welcome in the glare of the lights, as she had waved her farewell to us 13 months before, but lying white and fair in her coffin in the house where she was born. The last 13 days of Susie's life were spent in our own house in Hartford, the home of her childhood, and always the dearest place in the earth to her. About her she had faithful old friends, her pastor, Mr. Twitchell, who had known her from the cradle, and who had come a long journey to be with her, her uncle and aunt, Mr. and Mrs. Theodore Crane, Patrick, the coachman, Katie, who had begun to serve us when Susie was a child of 8 years, John and Ellen, who had been with us many years. Also Jean was there. At the hour when my wife and Clara set sail for America, Susie was in no danger. 3 hours later there came a sudden change for the worse. Meningitis set in, and it was immediately apparent that she was death-struck. That was Saturday, the 15th of August. That evening she took food for the last time, Jean's letter to me. The next morning the brain fever was raging. She walked the floor a little in her pain and delirium, then succumbed to weakness and returned to her bed. Previously she had found hanging in a closet a gown which she had seen her mother wear. She thought it was her mother, dead, and she kissed it and cried. About noon she became blind, an effect of the disease, and bewailed it to her uncle. From Jean's letter I take this sentence, which needs no comment. About 1 in the afternoon Susie spoke for the last time. It was only one word that she said when she spoke that last time, and it told of her longing. She groped with her hands and found Katy and caressed her face and said, "Mamma." How gracious it was that, in that forlorn hour of wreck and ruin, with the night of death closing around her, she should have been granted that beautiful illusion, that the latest vision which rested upon the clouded mirror of her mind should have been the vision of her mother, and the latest emotion she should know in life the joy and peace of that dear imagined presence. About 2 o'clock she composed herself as if for sleep, and never moved again. She fell into unconsciousness, and so remained 2 days and 5 hours until Tuesday evening at 7 minutes past 7, when the release came. She was 24 years and 5 months old. On the 23rd her mother and her sisters saw her laid to rest, she that had been our wonder and our worship. In one of her own books I find some verses which I will copy here. Apparently she always put borrowed matter in quotation marks. These verses lack those marks, and therefore I take them to be her own. Love came at dawn, when all the world was fair, when crimson glories bloom and sun were rife. Love came at dawn, when hope's wings fanned the air, and murmured, "I am life." Love came at eve, and when the day was done, when heart and brain were tired and slumber pressed, love came at eve, shut out the sinking sun, and whispered, "I am rest." The summer seasons of Susie's childhood were spent at Quarry Farm, on the hills east of Elmira, New York. The other seasons of the year at the home in Hartford. Like other children, she was blithe and happy, fond of play. Unlike the average children, she was at times much given to retiring within herself, and trying to search out the hidden meanings of the deep things that make the puzzle and pathos of human existence, and in all the ages have baffled the inquirer and mocked him. As a little child, aged 7, she was oppressed and perplexed by the maddening repetition of the stock incidents of our race's fleeting sojourn here, just as the same thing has oppressed and perplexed maturer minds from the beginning of time. A myriad of men are born. They labor and sweat and struggle for bread. They squabble and scold and fight. They scramble for little mean advantages over each other. Age creeps upon them. Infirmities follow. Shames and humiliations bring down their prides and their vanities. Those they love are taken from them, and the joy of life is turned to aching grief. The burden of pain, care, misery, grows heavier year by year. At length ambition is dead, pride is dead, vanity is dead, longing for release is in their place. It comes at last, the only unpoisoned gift earth ever had for them, and they vanish from a world where they were of no consequence, where they achieved nothing, where they were a mistake and a failure and a foolishness. There they have left no sign that they have existed, a world which will lament them a day and forget them forever. Then another myriad takes their place, and copies all they did, and goes along the same profitless road, and vanishes as they vanished, to make room for another, and a million other myriads, to follow the same arid path through the same desert, and accomplish what the first myriad and all the myriads that came after it accomplished: nothing. "Mamma, what is it all for?" asked Susie, preliminarily stating the above details in her own halting language, after long brooding over them alone in the privacy of the nursery. A year later she was groping her way alone through another sunless bog, but this time she reached a rest for her feet. For a week her mother had not been able to go to the nursery evenings at the child's prayer hour. She spoke of it, was sorry for it, and said she would come tonight, and hoped she could continue to come every night and hear Susie pray as before. Noticing that the child wished to respond, but was evidently troubled as to how to word her answer, she asked what the difficulty was. Susie explained that Miss Foote, the governess, had been teaching her about the Indians and their religious beliefs, whereby it appeared that they had not only a God, but several. This had set Susie to thinking. As a result of this thinking, she had stopped praying. She qualified this statement, that is, she modified it, saying she did not now pray in the same way as she had formerly done. Her mother said, "Tell me about it, dear." "Well, Mamma, the Indians believed they knew, but now we know they were wrong. By and by it can turn out that we are wrong, so now I only pray that there may be a God and a heaven, or something better." I wrote down this pathetic prayer in its precise wording at the time in a record which we kept of the children's sayings, and my reverence for it has grown with the years that have passed over my head since then. Its untaught grace and simplicity are a child's, but the wisdom and the pathos of it are of all the ages that have come and gone since the race of man has lived, and longed, and hoped, and feared, and doubted. To go back a year, Susie aged 7. Several times her mother said to her, "There, there, Susie, you mustn't cry over little things." This furnished Susie a text for thought. She had been breaking her heart over what had seemed vast disasters: a broken toy, a picnic cancelled by thunder and lightning and rain, the mouse that was growing tame and friendly in the nursery caught and killed by the cat. And now came this strange revelation. For some unaccountable reason these were not vast calamities. Why? How is the size of calamities measured? What is the rule? There must be some way to tell the great ones from the small ones. What is the law of these proportions? She examined the problem earnestly and long. She gave it her best thought from time to time for 2 or 3 days, but it baffled her and defeated her, and at last she gave up and went to her mother for help. "Mamma, what is little things?" It seemed a simple question at first, and yet before the answer could be put into words, unsuspected and unforeseen difficulties began to appear. They increased, they multiplied, they brought about another defeat. The effort to explain came to a standstill. Then Susie tried to help her mother out with an instance, an example, an illustration. The mother was getting ready to go downtown, and one of her errands was to buy a long-promised toy watch for Susie. "If you forgot the watch, Mamma, would that be a little thing?" She was not concerned about the watch, for she knew it would not be forgotten. What she was hoping for was that the answer would unriddle the riddle, and bring rest and peace to her perplexed little mind. The hope was disappointed, of course, for the reason that the size of a misfortune is not determinable by an outsider's measurement of it, but only by the measurements applied to it by the person specially affected by it. The king's lost crown is a vast matter to the king, but of no consequence to the child. The lost toy is a great matter to the child, but in the king's eyes it is not a thing to break the heart about. A verdict was reached, but it was based upon the above model, and Susie was granted leave to measure her disasters thereafter with her own tape line. As a child, Susie had a passionate temper, and it cost her much remorse and many tears before she learned to govern it. But after that it was a wholesome salt, and her character was the stronger and healthier for its presence. It enabled her to be good with dignity. It preserved her not only from being good for vanity's sake, but from even the appearance of it. In looking back over the long-vanished years, it seems but natural and excusable that I should dwell with longing affection and preference upon incidents of her young life which made it beautiful to us, and that I should let its few small offenses go unsummoned and unreproached. In the summer of 1880, when Susie was just 8 years of age, the family were at Quarry Farm, as usual at that season of the year. Hay-cutting time was approaching, and Susie and Clara were counting the hours, for the time was big with a great event for them. They had been promised that they might mount the wagon and ride home from the fields on the summit of the Hay Mountain. This perilous privilege, so dear to their age and species, had never been granted them before. Their excitement had no bounds. They could talk of nothing but this epoch-making adventure now. But misfortune overtook Susie on the very morning of the important day. In a sudden outbreak of passion she corrected Clara with a shovel or stick or something of the sort. At any rate, the offense committed was of a gravity clearly beyond the limit allowed in the nursery. In accordance with the rule and custom of the house, Susie went to her mother to confess, and to help decide upon the size and character of the punishment due. It was quite understood that as a punishment could have but one rational object and function, to act as a reminder and warn the transgressor against transgressing in the same way again, the children would know about as well as any how to choose a penalty which would be rememberable and effective. Susie and her mother discussed various punishments, but none of them seemed adequate. This fault was an unusually serious one, and required the setting up of a danger signal in the memory that would not blow out nor burn out, but remain a fixture there and furnish its saving warning indefinitely. Among the punishments mentioned was deprivation of the hay-wagon ride. It was noticeable that this one hit Susie hard. Finally, in the summing up, the mother named over the list, and asked, "Which one do you think it ought to be, Susie?" Susie studied, shrank from her duty, and asked, "Which do you think, Mamma?" "Well, Susie, I would rather leave it to you. You make the choice yourself." It cost Susie a struggle and much and deep thinking and weighing, but she came out where anyone who knew her could have foretold she would. "Well, Mamma, I'll make it the hay-wagon, because you know the other things might not make me remember not to do it again, but if I don't get to ride on the hay-wagon, I can remember it easily." In this world the real penalty, the sharp one, the lasting one, never falls otherwise than on the wrong person. It was not I that corrected Clara, but the remembrance of poor Susie's lost hay-ride still brings me a pang, after 26 years. Apparently Susie was born with humane feelings for the animals, and compassion for their troubles. This enabled her to see a new point in an old story once, when she was only 6 years old, a point which had been overlooked by older, and perhaps duller, people for many ages. Her mother told her the moving story of the sale of Joseph by his brethren, the staining of his coat with the blood of the slaughtered kid, and the rest of it. She dwelt upon the inhumanity of the brothers, their cruelty towards their helpless young brother, and the unbrotherly treachery which they practiced upon him, for she hoped to teach the child a lesson in gentle pity and mercifulness which she would remember. Apparently her desire was accomplished, for the tears came into Susie's eyes, and she was deeply moved. And then she said, "Poor little kid." A child's frank envy of the privileges and distinctions of its elders is often a delicately flattering attention and the reverse of unwelcome, but sometimes the envy is not placed where the beneficiary is expecting it to be placed. Once, when Susie was 7, she sat breathlessly absorbed in watching a guest of ours adorn herself for a ball. The lady was charmed by this homage, this mute and gentle admiration, and was happy in it. And when her pretty labors were finished, and she stood at last perfect, unimprovable, clothed like Solomon in all his glory, she paused, confident and expectant, to receive from Susie's tongue the tribute that was burning in her eyes. Susie drew an envious little sigh, and said, "I wish I could have crooked teeth and spectacles." Once, when Susie was 6 months along in her 8th year, she did something one day in the presence of company which subjected her to criticism and reproof. Afterward, when she was alone with her mother, as was her custom, she reflected a little while over the matter. Then she set up what I think, and what the shade of Burns would think, was a quite good philosophical defense. "Well, Mamma, you know I didn't see myself, and so I couldn't know how it looked." In homes where the near friends and visitors are mainly literary people, lawyers, judges, professors, and clergymen, the children's ears become early familiarized with wide vocabularies. It is natural for them to pick up any words that fall in their way. It is natural for them to pick up big and little ones indiscriminately. It is natural for them to use without fear any word that comes to their net, no matter how formidable it may be as to size. As a result, their talk is a curious and funny musketry clatter of little words, interrupted at intervals by the heavy artillery crash of a word of such imposing sound and size that it seems to shake the ground and rattle the windows. Sometimes the child gets a wrong idea of a word which it has picked up by chance, and attaches to it a meaning which impairs its usefulness. But this does not happen as often as one might expect it would. Indeed, it happens with an infrequency which may be regarded as remarkable. As a child, Susie had good fortune with her large words, and she employed many of them. She made no more than her fair share of mistakes. Once, when she thought something very funny was going to happen, but it didn't, she was racked and torn with laughter by anticipation. But apparently she still felt sure of her position, for she said, "If it had happened, I should have been transported, with glee." And earlier, when she was a little maid of 5 years, she informed a visitor that she had been in a church only once, and that was the time when Clara was christened. In Heidelberg, when Susie was 6, she noticed that the Schloss gardens were populous with snails creeping all about everywhere. One day she found a new dish on her table and inquired concerning it, and learned that it was made of snails. She was awed and impressed, and said, "Wild ones, mamma?" She was thoughtful and considerate of others, an acquired quality, no doubt. No one seems to be born with it. One hot day at home in Hartford, when she was a little child, her mother borrowed her fan several times, a Japanese one, value 5 cents, refreshed herself with it a moment or two, then handed it back with a word of thanks. Susie knew her mother would use the fan all the time if she could do it without putting a deprivation upon its owner. She also knew that her mother could not be persuaded to do that. A relief must be devised somehow. Susie devised it. She got 5 cents out of her money box and carried it to Patrick and asked him to take it downtown, a mile and a half, and buy a Japanese fan and bring it home. He did it, and thus thoughtfully and delicately was the exigency met and the mother's comfort secured. It is to the child's credit that she did not save herself expense by bringing down another and more costly kind of fan from upstairs, but was content to act upon the impression that her mother desired the Japanese kind, content to accomplish the desire and stop with that, without troubling about the wisdom or unwisdom of it. Sometimes, while she was still a child, her speech fell into quaint and strikingly expressive forms. Once, aged 9 or 10, she came to her mother's room when her sister Jean was a baby, and said Jean was crying in the nursery, and asked if she might ring for the nurse. Her mother asked, "Is she crying hard?" meaning cross, ugly. "Well, no, mamma. It is a weary, lonesome cry." It is a pleasure to me to recall various incidents which reveal the delicacies of feeling that were so considerable a part of her budding character. Such a revelation came once in a way which, while creditable to her heart, was defective in another direction. She was in her 11th year then. Her mother had been making the Christmas purchases, and she allowed Susie to see the presents which were for Patrick's children. Among these was a handsome sled for Jimmy, on which a stag was painted, also in gilt capitals the word "Dear." Susie was excited and joyous over everything until she came to this sled. Then she became sober and silent, yet the sled was the choicest of all the gifts. Her mother was surprised and also disappointed, and said, "Why, Susie, doesn't it please you? Isn't it fine?" Susie hesitated, and it was plain that she did not want to say the thing that was in her mind. However, being urged, she brought it haltingly out. "Well, mamma, it is fine, and of course it did cost a good deal, but why should that be mentioned?" Seeing that she was not understood, she reluctantly pointed to the word "dear." It was her orthography that was at fault, not her heart. She had inherited both from her mother. Mark Twain. End of Chapter 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, October 19, 1906, Chapters from My Autobiography, Chapter 4, by Mark Twain. When Susie was 13 and was a slender little maid with plaited tails of copper-tinged brown hair down her back, and was perhaps the busiest bee in the household hive, by reason of the manifold studies, health exercises, and recreations she had to attend to, she secretly, and of her own motion, and out of love, added another task to her labors, the writing of a biography of me. She did this work in her bedroom at night, and kept her record hidden. After a little the mother discovered it, and filched it, and let me see it, then told Susie what she had done, and how pleased I was, and how proud. I remember that time with a deep pleasure. I had had compliments before, but none that touched me like this, none that could approach it for value in my eyes. It has kept that place always since. I've had no compliment, no praise, no tribute from any source that was so precious to me as this one was, and still is. As I read it now, after all these many years, it is still a king's message to me, and brings me the same dear surprise it brought me then, with the pathos added of the thought that the eager and hasty hand that sketched it and scrawled it will not touch mine again. And I feel as the humble and unexpectant must feel when their eyes fall upon the edict that raises them to the ranks of the noble. Yesterday, while I was rummaging in a pile of ancient notebooks of mine which I had not seen for years, I came across a reference to that biography. It is quite evident that several times at breakfast and dinner, in those long past days, I was posing for the biography. In fact, I clearly remember that I was doing that, and I also remember that Susie detected it. I remember saying a very smart thing with a good deal of an air at the breakfast table one morning, and that Susie observed to her mother privately a little later that Papa was doing that for the biography. I cannot bring myself to change any line or word in Susie's sketch of me, but will introduce passages from it now and then, just as they came in their quaint simplicity out of her honest heart, which was the beautiful heart of a child. What comes from that source has a charm and grace of its own, which may transgress all the recognized laws of literature, if it choose, and yet be literature still, and worthy of hospitality. I shall print the whole of this little biography before I have done with it, every word, every sentence. The spelling is frequently desperate, but it was Susie's, and it shall stand. I love it, and cannot profane it. To me it is gold. To correct it would alloy it, and not refine it. It would spoil it. It would take from it its freedom and flexibility, and make it stiff and formal. Even when it is most extravagant, I am not shocked. It is Susie's spelling, and she was doing the best she could, and nothing could better it for me. Susie began the biography in 1885, when I was in the 50th year of my age, and she just entering the 14th of hers. She begins in this way. We are a very happy family. We consist of Papa, Mama, Jean, Clara, and me. It is Papa I am writing about, and I shall have no trouble in not knowing what to say about him, as he is a very striking character. But wait a minute, I will return to Susie presently. In the matter of slavish imitation, man is the monkey's superior all the time. The average man is destitute of independence of opinion. He is not interested in contriving an opinion of his own by study and reflection, but is only anxious to find out what his neighbor's opinion is, and slavishly adopt it. A generation ago I found out that the latest review of a book was pretty sure to be just a reflection of the earliest review of it, that whatever the first reviewer found to praise or censure in the book would be repeated in the latest reviewer's report, with nothing fresh added. Therefore, more than once I took the precaution of sending my book in manuscript to Mr. Howells, when he was editor of the Atlantic Monthly, so that he could prepare a review of it at leisure. I knew he would say the truth about the book. I also knew that he would find more merit than demerit in it, because I already knew that that was the condition of the book. I allowed no copy of it to go out of the press until after Mr. Howells's notice of it had appeared. That book was always safe. There wasn't a man behind a pen in all America that had the courage to find anything in the book which Mr. Howells had not found. There wasn't a man behind a pen in America that had spirit enough to say a brave and original thing about the book on his own responsibility. I believe that the trade of critic, in literature, music, and the drama, is the most degraded of all trades, and that it has no real value, certainly no large value. When Charles Dudley Warner and I were about to bring out The Gilded Age, the editor of the Daily Graphic persuaded me to let him have an advance copy, he giving me his word of honor that no notice of it would appear in his paper until after the Atlantic Monthly notice should have appeared. This reptile published a review of the book within 3 days afterward. I could not really complain, because he had only given me his word of honor as security. I ought to have required of him something substantial. I believe his notice did not deal mainly with the merit of the book, or the lack of it, but with my moral attitude toward the public. It was charged that I had used my reputation to play a swindle upon the public, that Mr. Warner had written as much as half of the book, and that I had used my name to float it and give it currency. A currency, so the critic averred, which it could not have acquired without my name, and that this conduct of mine was a grave fraud upon the people. The Graphic was not an authority upon any subject whatever. It had a sort of distinction in that it was the first and only illustrated daily newspaper that the world had seen, but it was without character. It was poorly and cheaply edited. Its opinions of a book or of any other work of art was of no consequence. Everybody knew this, yet all the critics in America, one after the other, copied the Graphic's criticism, merely changing the phraseology, and left me under that charge of dishonest conduct. Even the great Chicago Tribune, the most important journal in the Middle West, was not able to invent anything fresh, but adopted the view of the humble Daily Graphic, dishonesty charge and all. However, let it go. It is the will of God that we must have critics and missionaries and congressmen and humorists, and we must bear the burden. Meantime, I seem to have been drifting into criticism myself, but that is nothing. At the worst, criticism is nothing more than a crime, and I am not unused to that. What I have been traveling towards all this time is this. The first critic that ever had occasion to describe my personal appearance littered his description with foolish and inexcusable errors, whose aggregate furnished the result that I was distinctly and distressingly unhandsome. That description floated around the country in the papers, and was in constant use and wear for a quarter of a century. It seems strange to me that apparently no critic in the country could be found who could look at me and have the courage to take up his pen and destroy that lie. That lie began its course on the Pacific coast in 1864, and it likened me in personal appearance to Petroleum V. Nasby, who had been out there lecturing. For 25 years afterward, no critic could furnish a description of me without fetching in Nasby to help out my portrait. I knew Nasby well, and he was a good fellow, but in my life I have not felt maligned enough about any more than 3 persons to charge those persons with resembling Nasby. It hurts me to the heart. I was always handsome. Anybody but a critic could have seen it. It had long been a distress to my family, including Susie, that the critics could go on making this wearisome mistake year after year when there was no foundation for it. Even when a critic wanted to be particularly friendly and complimentary to me, he didn't dare to go beyond my clothes. He never ventured beyond that old safe frontier. When he had finished with my clothes, he had said all the kind things, the pleasant things, the complimentary things he could risk. Then he dropped back on Nasby. Yesterday I found this clipping in the pocket of one of those ancient memorandum books of mine. It is of the date of 39 years ago, and both the paper and the ink are yellow with the bitterness that I felt in that old day when I clipped it out to preserve it, and brood over it, and grieve about it. I will copy it here, to wit. A correspondent of the Philadelphia Press, writing of one of Schuyler Colfax's receptions, says of our Washington correspondent, "Mark Twain, the delicate humorist, was present. Quite a lion, as he deserves to be, Mark is a bachelor, faultless in taste, whose snowy vest is suggestive of endless quarrels with Washington washerwomen. But the heroism of Mark is settled for all time, for such purity and smoothness was never seen before. His lavender gloves might have been stolen from some Turkish harem, so delicate were they in size, but more likely, anything else were more likely than that. In form and feature he bears some resemblance to the immortal Nasby, but whilst petroleum is brunette to the core, Twain is golden, amber-hued, melting blonde. Let us return to Susy's biography now and get the opinion of one who is unbiased. From Susy's biography. Papa's appearance has been described many times, but very incorrectly. He has beautiful gray hair, not any too thick or any too long, but just right, a Roman nose, which greatly improves the beauty of his features, kind blue eyes, and a small mustache. He has a wonderfully shaped head and profile. He has a very good figure. In short, he is an extraordinarily fine-looking man. All his features are perfect, except that he hasn't extraordinary teeth. His complexion is very fair, and he doesn't wear a beard. He is a very good man, and a very funny one. He has got a temper, but we all of us have in this family. He is the loveliest man I ever saw or ever hope to see, and oh, so absent-minded. He does tell perfectly delightful stories. Clara and I used to sit on each arm of his chair and listen while he told us stories about the pictures on the wall. I remember the story-telling days vividly. They were a difficult and exacting audience, those little creatures. Along one side of the library in the Hartford home, the bookshelves joined the mantelpiece. In fact, there were shelves on both sides of the mantelpiece. On these shelves and on the mantelpiece stood various ornaments. At one end of the procession was a framed oil painting of a cat's head. At the other end was a head of a beautiful young girl, life-size, called Emmeline, because she looked just about like that, an impressionist watercolor. Between the one picture and the other there were 12 or 15 of the bric-a-brac things already mentioned, also an oil painting by Elihu Vedder, the young Medusa. Every now and then the children required me to construct a romance, always impromptu, not a moment's preparation permitted, and into that romance I had to get all that bric-a-brac and the 3 pictures. I had to start always with the cat and finish with Emmeline. I was never allowed the refreshment of a change end for end. It was not permissible to introduce a bric-a-brac ornament into the story out of its place in the procession. These bric-a-bracs were never allowed a peaceful day, a reposeful day, a restful Sabbath. In their lives there was no Sabbath. In their lives there was no peace. They knew no existence but a monotonous career of violence and bloodshed. In the course of time the bric-a-brac and the pictures showed wear. It was because they had had so many and such tumultuous adventures in their romantic careers. As romancer to the children I had a hard time, even from the beginning. If they brought me a picture in a magazine and required me to build a story to it, they would cover the rest of the page with their pudgy hands to keep me from stealing an idea from it. The stories had to come hot from the bat, always. They had to be absolutely original and fresh. Sometimes the children furnished me simply a character or 2 or a dozen, and required me to start out at once on that slim basis and deliver those characters up to a vigorous and entertaining life of crime. If they heard of a new trade, or an unfamiliar animal, or anything like that, I was pretty sure to have to deal with those things in the next romance. Once Clara required me to build a sudden tale out of a plumber and a boa constrictor, and I had to do it. She didn't know what a boa constrictor was until he developed in the tale. Then she was better satisfied with it than ever. From Susy's biography. Papa's favorite game is billiards, and when he is tired and wishes to rest himself, he stays up all night and plays billiards. It seems to rest his head. He smokes a great deal, almost incessantly. He has the mind of an author exactly. Some of the simplest things he can't understand. Our burglar alarm is often out of order, and Papa had been obliged to take the mahogany room off from the alarm altogether for a time, because the burglar alarm had been in the habit of ringing even when the mahogany room was closed. At length he thought that perhaps the burglar alarm might be in order, and he decided to try and see. Accordingly he put it on, and then went down and opened the window. Consequently the alarm bell rang. It would, even if the alarm had been in order. Papa went despairingly upstairs and said to Mamma, "Livy, the mahogany room won't go on. I have just opened the window to see." "Why, Youth," Mamma replied, "if you've opened the window, why, of course the alarm will ring." "That's what I've opened it for. Why, I just went down to see if it would ring." Mamma tried to explain to Papa that when he wanted to go and see whether the alarm would ring while the window was closed, he mustn't go and open the window. But in vain. Papa couldn't understand, and got very impatient with Mamma for trying to make him believe an impossible thing true. This is a frank biography, and an honest one. She uses no sandpaper on me. I have to this day the same dull head in the matter of conundrums and perplexities which Susy had discovered in those long-gone days. Complexities annoy me, they irritate me, then this progressive feeling presently warms into anger. I cannot get far in the reading of the commonest and simplest contract, with its parties of the first part, and parties of the second part, and parties of the third part, before my temper is all gone. Ashcroft comes up here every day and pathetically tries to make me understand the points of the lawsuit which we are conducting against Henry Butters, Harold Wheeler, and the rest of those plasmon buccaneers, but daily he has to give it up. It is pitiful to see, when he bends his earnest and appealing eyes upon me and says after one of his efforts, "Now you do understand that, don't you?" I am always obliged to say, "I don't, Ashcroft. I wish I could understand it, but I don't. Send for the cat." In the days which Susy is talking about, a perplexity fell to my lot one day. F. G. Whitmore was my business agent, and he brought me out from town in his buggy. We drove by the porte cochere and towards the stable. Now this was a single road, and was like a spoon whose handle stretched from the gate to a great round flower-bed in the neighborhood of the stable. At the approach to the flower-bed the road divided and circumnavigated it, making a loop, which I have likened to the bowl of the spoon. As we neared the loop, I saw that Whitmore was laying his course to port. I was sitting on the starboard side, the side the house was on, and was going to start around that spoon bowl on that left-hand side. I said, "Don't do that, Whitmore. Take the right-hand side. Then I shall be next to the house when we get to the door." He said, "That will not happen in any case. It doesn't make any difference which way I go around this flower-bed." I explained to him that he was an ass, but he stuck to his proposition, and I said, "Go on and try it and see." He went on and tried it, and sure enough he fetched me up at the door on the very side that he had said I would be. I was not able to believe it then, and I don't believe it yet. I said, "Whitmore, that is merely an accident. You can't do it again." He said he could, and he drove down into the street, fetched round, came back, and actually did it again. I was stupefied, paralyzed, petrified, with these strange results. But they did not convince me. I didn't believe he could do it another time, but he did. He said he could do it all day, and fetch up the same way every time. By that time my temper was gone, and I asked him to go home and apply to the asylum, and I would pay the expenses. I didn't want to see him any more for a week. I went upstairs in a rage, and started to tell Livy about it, expecting to get her sympathy for me, and to breed aversion in her for Whitmore. But she merely burst into peal after peal of laughter as the tale of my adventure went on, for her head was like Susy's. Riddles and complexities had no terrors for it. Her mind and Susy's were analytical. I have tried to make it appear that mine was different. Many and many a time I have told that buggy experiment, hoping against hope that I would some time or other find somebody who would be on my side, but it has never happened. And I am never able to go glibly forward and state the circumstances of that buggy's progress without having to halt and consider, and call up in my mind the spoon-handle, the bowl of the spoon, the buggy and the horse, and my position in the buggy. And the minute I have got that far and try to turn it to the left it goes to ruin. I can't see how it is ever going to fetch me out right when we get to the door. Susy is right in her estimate. I can't understand things. That burglar alarm which Susy mentions led a gay and careless life, and had no principles. It was generally out of order at one point or another, and there was plenty of opportunity, because all the windows and doors in the house, from the cellar up to the top floor, were connected with it. However, in its season of being out of order, it could trouble us for only a very little while. We quickly found out that it was fooling us, and that it was buzzing its blood-curdling alarm merely for its own amusement. Then we would shut it off and send it to New York for the electrician, there not being one in all Hartford in those days. When the repairs were finished we would set the alarm again and reestablish our confidence in it. It never did any real business except upon one single occasion. All the rest of its expensive career was frivolous and without purpose. Just that one time it performed its duty, and its whole duty, gravely, seriously, admirably. It let fly about 2 o'clock one black and dreary March morning, and I turned out promptly, because I knew that it was not fooling, this time. The bathroom door was on my side of the bed. I stepped in there, turned up the gas, looked at the annunciator, and turned off the alarm, so far as the door indicated was concerned, thus stopping the racket. Then I came back to bed. Mrs. Clemens opened the debate. "What was it?" "It was the cellar door." "Was it a burglar, do you think?" "Yes," I said, "of course it was. Did you suppose it was a Sunday school superintendent?" "No. What do you suppose he wants?" "I suppose he wants jewelry, but he is not acquainted with the house, and he thinks it is in the cellar. I don't like to disappoint a burglar who I am not acquainted with, and who has done me no harm, but if he had had common sagacity enough to inquire, I could have told him we kept nothing down there but coal and vegetables. Still, it may be that he is acquainted with the place, and that what he really wants is coal and vegetables. On the whole, I think it is vegetables he is after." "Are you going down to see?" "No, I could not be of any assistance. Let him select for himself. I don't know where the things are." Then she said, "But suppose he comes up to the ground floor?" "That's all right. We shall know it the minute he opens a door on that floor. It will set off the alarm." Just then the terrific buzzing broke out again. I said, "He has arrived. I told you he would. I know all about burglars and their ways. They are systematic people." I went into the bathroom to see if I was right, and I was. I shut off the dining room and stopped the buzzing, and came back to bed. My wife said, "What do you suppose he is after now?" I said, "I think he has got all the vegetables he wants, and is coming up for napkin rings and odds and ends for the wife and children. They all have families, burglars have, and they are always thoughtful of them, always take a few necessaries of life for themselves, and fill out with tokens of remembrance for the family. In taking them they do not forget us. Those very things represent tokens of his remembrance of us, and also of our remembrance of him. We never get them again. The memory of the attention remains embalmed in our hearts." "Are you going down to see what it is he wants now?" "No," I said. "I am no more interested than I was before. They are experienced people, burglars. They know what they want. I should be no help to him. I think he is after ceramics and bric-a-brac and such things. If he knows the house, he knows that that is all that he can find on the dining-room floor." She said with a strong interest perceptible in her tone, "Suppose he comes up here?" I said, "It is all right. He will give us notice." "What shall we do then?" "Climb out the window." She said a little restively, "Well, what is the use of a burglar alarm for us?" "Well, you have seen, dear heart, that it has been useful up to the present moment, and I have explained to you how it will be continuously useful after he gets up here." That was the end of it. He didn't ring any more alarms. Presently I said, "He is disappointed, I think. He has gone off with the vegetables and the bric-a-brac, and I think he is dissatisfied." We went to sleep, and at 8:15 in the morning I was out and hurrying, for I was to take the 8:29 train for New York. I found the gas burning brightly, full head, all over the first floor. My new overcoat was gone, my old umbrella was gone, my new patent leather shoes, which I had never worn, were gone. The large window which opened into the ombra at the rear of the house was standing wide. I passed out through it and tracked the burglar down the hill through the trees, tracked him without difficulty because he had blazed his progress with imitation silver napkin rings and my umbrella and various other things which he had disapproved of. And I went back in triumph and proved to my wife that he was a disappointed burglar. I had suspected he would be from the start, and from his not coming up to our floor to get human beings. Things happened to me that day in New York. I will tell about them another time. From Susy's Biography. Papa has a peculiar gait we like. It seems just to suit him, but most people do not. He always walks up and down the room while thinking, and between each course at meals. A lady distantly related to us came to visit us once in those days. She came to stay a week, but all our efforts to make her happy failed. We could not imagine why, and she got up her anchor and sailed the next morning. We did much guessing, but could not solve the mystery. Later we found out what the trouble was. It was my tramping up and down between the courses. She conceived the idea that I could not stand her society. That word youth, as the reader has perhaps already guessed, was my wife's pet name for me. It was gently satirical, but also affectionate. I had certain mental and material peculiarities and customs proper to a much younger person than I was. From Susie's Biography. Papa is very fond of animals, particularly of cats. We had a dear little gray kitten once that he named Lazy. Papa always wears gray to match his hair and eyes, and he would carry him around on his shoulder. It was a mighty pretty sight, the gray cat sound asleep against Papa's gray coat and hair. The names that he has given our different cats are really remarkably funny. They are namely Stray Kit, Abner, Motley, Fraulein, Lazy, Buffalo Bill, Cleveland, Sour Mash, and Pestilence and Famine. At one time when the children were small, we had a very black mother cat named Satan, and Satan had a small black offspring named Sin. Pronouns were a difficulty for the children. Little Clara came in one day, her black eyes snapping with indignation, and said, "Papa, Satan ought to be punished. She is out there at the greenhouse, and there she stays and stays, and his kitten is downstairs crying." From Susie's Biography. Papa uses very strong language, but I have an idea not nearly so strong as when he first married Mama. A lady acquaintance of his is rather apt to interrupt what one is saying, and Papa told Mama that he thought he should say to the lady's husband, "I am glad your wife wasn't present when the deity said, 'Let there be light.'" It is as I have said before. This is a frank historian. She doesn't cover up one's deficiencies, but gives them an equal showing with one's handsomer qualities. Of course I made the remark which she has quoted, and even at this distant day I am still as much as half persuaded that if that lady had been present when the Creator said, "Let there be light," she would have interrupted him, and we shouldn't ever have got it. From Susie's Biography. Papa said the other day, "I am a mugwump, and a mugwump is pure from the marrow out." Papa knows I am writing this biography of him, and he said this for it. He doesn't like to go to church at all. Why, I never understood until just now. He told us the other day that he couldn't bear to hear anyone talk but himself, but that he could listen to himself talk for hours without getting tired. Of course he said this in joke, but I've no doubt it was founded on truth. Mark Twain, to be continued. End of Chapter 4. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. From the North American Review, November 2, 1906, Chapters from My Autobiography, by Mark Twain, Chapter 5. Susie's remark about my strong language troubles me, and I must go back to it. All through the first 10 years of my married life I kept a constant and discreet watch upon my tongue while in the house, and went outside and to a distance when circumstances were too much for me and I was obliged to seek relief. I prized my wife's respect and approval above all the rest of the human race's respect and approval. I dreaded the day when she should discover that I was but a whited sepulchre, partly freighted with suppressed language. I was so careful during 10 years that I had not a doubt that my suppression had been successful. Therefore I was quite as happy in my guilt as I could have been if I had been innocent. But at last an accident exposed me. I went into the bathroom one morning to make my toilet, and carelessly left the door 2 or 3 inches ajar. It was the first time that I had ever failed to take the precaution of closing it tightly. I knew the necessity of being particular about this, because shaving was always a trying ordeal for me, and I could seldom carry it through to a finish without verbal helps. Now this time I was unprotected, but did not suspect it. I had no extraordinary trouble with my razor on this occasion, and was able to worry through with mere mutterings and growlings of an improper sort, but with nothing noisy or emphatic about them, no snapping and barking. Then I put on a shirt. My shirts are an invention of my own. They open in the back, and are buttoned there, when there are buttons. This time the button was missing. My temper jumped up several degrees in a moment, and my remarks rose accordingly, both in loudness and vigor of expression. But I was not troubled, for the bathroom door was a solid one, and I supposed it was firmly closed. I flung up the window and threw the shirt out. It fell upon the shrubbery where the people on their way to church could admire it if they wanted to. There was merely 50 feet of grass between the shirt and the passer-by. Still rumbling and thundering distantly, I put on another shirt. Again the button was absent. I augmented my language to meet the emergency, and threw that shirt out the window. I was too angry, too insane, to examine the third shirt, but put it furiously on. Again the button was absent, and that shirt followed its comrades out of the window. Then I straightened up, gathered my reserves, and let myself go like a cavalry charge. In the midst of that great assault my eye fell upon that gaping door, and I was paralyzed. It took me a good while to finish my toilet. I extended the time unnecessarily in trying to make up my mind as to what I would best do in the circumstances. I tried to hope that Mrs. Clemens was asleep, but I knew better. I could not escape by the window. It was narrow, and suited only to shirts. At last I made up my mind to boldly loaf through the bedroom with the air of a person who had not been doing anything. I made half the journey successfully. I did not turn my eyes in her direction, because that would not be safe. It is very difficult to look as if you have not been doing anything when the facts are the other way, and my confidence in my performance oozed steadily out of me as I went along. I was aiming for the left-hand door because it was furthest from my wife. It had never been opened from the day that the house was built, but it seemed a blessed refuge for me now. The bed was this one, wherein I am lying now, and dictating these histories morning after morning with so much serenity. It was this same old elaborately carved black Venetian bedstead, the most comfortable bedstead that ever was, with space enough in it for a family, and carved angels enough surmounting its twisted columns and its headboard and footboard to bring peace to the sleepers and pleasant dreams. I had to stop in the middle of the room. I hadn't the strength to go on. I believed that I was under accusing eyes, that even the carved angels were inspecting me with an unfriendly gaze. You know how it is when you are convinced that somebody behind you is looking steadily at you. You have to turn your face. You can't help it. I turned mine. The bed was placed as it is now, with the foot where the head ought to be. If it had been placed as it should have been, the high headboard would have sheltered me, but the footboard was no sufficient protection, for I could be seen over it. I was exposed. I was wholly without protection. I turned, because I couldn't help it, and my memory of what I saw is still vivid after all these years. Against the white pillows I saw the black head. I saw that young and beautiful face, and I saw the gracious eyes, with a something in them which I'd never seen there before. They were snapping and flashing with indignation. I felt myself crumbling. I felt myself shrinking away to nothing under that accusing gaze. I stood silent under that desolating fire for as much as a minute, I should say. It seemed a very, very long time. Then my wife's lips parted, and from them issued my latest bathroom remark. The language perfect, but the expression velvety, unpractical, apprentice-like, ignorant, inexperienced, comically inadequate, absurdly weak, and unsuited to the great language. In my lifetime I had never heard anything so out of tune, so inharmonious, so incongruous, so ill-suited to each other, as were those mighty words set to that feeble music. I tried to keep from laughing, for I was a guilty person in deep need of charity and mercy. I tried to keep from bursting, and I succeeded, until she gravely said, "There, now you know how it sounds." Then I exploded. The air was filled with my fragments, and you could hear them whiz. I said, "Oh, Livy, if it sounds like that, I will never do it again." Then she had to laugh herself. Both of us broke into convulsions, and went on laughing until we were physically exhausted and spiritually reconciled. The children were present at breakfast. Clara, age 6, and Susie, 8, and the mother made a guarded remark about strong language. Guarded because she did not wish the children to suspect anything. A guarded remark which censured strong language. Both children broke out in one voice with this comment, "Why, Mama, Papa uses it." I was astonished. I had supposed that that secret was safe in my own breast, and that its presence had never been suspected. I asked, "How did you know, you little rascals?" "Oh," they said, "we often listen over the balusters when you are in the hall explaining things to George." From Susie's Biography. One of Papa's latest books is The Prince and the Pauper, and it is unquestionably the best book he has ever written. Some people want him to keep to his old style. Some gentleman wrote him, "I enjoyed Huckleberry Finn immensely, and am glad to see that you have returned to your old style." That annoyed me greatly, because it troubles me. Susie was troubled by that word, and uncertain. She wrote a U above it in the proper place, but reconsidered the matter, and struck it out. To have so few people know Papa, I mean really know him. They think of Mark Twain as a humorist, joking at everything, and with a mop of reddish-brown hair which sorely needs the barber's brush, a Roman nose, short stubby mustache, a sad, careworn face, with many crow's feet, etc. That is the way people picture Papa. I have wanted Papa to write a book that would reveal something of his kind, sympathetic nature, and The Prince and the Pauper partly does it. The book is full of lovely, charming ideas, and oh, the language, it is perfect. I think that one of the most touching scenes in it is where the pauper is riding on horseback with his nobles in the recognition procession, and he sees his mother. Oh, and then what followed! How she runs to his side when she sees him throw up his hand palm outward and is rudely pushed off by one of the king's officers, and then how the little pauper's conscience troubles him when he remembers the shameful words that were falling from his lips when she was turned from his side. "I know you not, woman," and how his grandeurs were stricken valueless and his pride consumed to ashes. It is a wonderfully beautiful and touching little scene, and Papa has described it so wonderfully. I never saw a man with so much variety of feeling as Papa has. Now, The Prince and the Pauper is full of touching places, but there is most always a streak of humor in them somewhere. Now in the stirring coronation, just after the little king has got his crown back again, Papa brings that in about the seal, where the pauper says he used the seal to crack nuts with. Oh, it is so funny and nice. Papa very seldom writes a passage without some humor in it somewhere, and I don't think he ever will. The children always helped their mother to edit my books in manuscript. She would sit on the porch at the farm and read aloud with her pencil in her hand, and the children would keep an alert and suspicious eye upon her right along, for the belief was well grounded in them that whenever she came across a particularly satisfactory passage, she would strike it out. Their suspicions were well founded. The passages which were so satisfactory to them always had an element of strength in them which sorely needed modification or expurgation, and were always sure to get it at their mother's hand. For my own entertainment, and to enjoy the protests of the children, I often abused my editor's innocent confidence. I often interlarded remarks of a studied and felicitously atrocious character purposely to achieve the children's brief delight, and then see the remorseless pencil do its fatal work. I often joined my supplications to the children's for mercy, and strung the argument out and pretended to be in earnest. They were deceived, and so was their mother. It was 3 against 1, and most unfair, but it was very delightful, and I could not resist the temptation. Now and then we gained the victory, and there was much rejoicing. Then I privately struck the passage out myself. It had served its purpose. It had furnished 3 of us with good entertainment, and in being removed from the book by me, it was only suffering the fate originally intended for it. From Susie's Biography. Papa was born in Missouri. His mother is Grandma Clemens, Jane Lampton Clemens, of Kentucky. Grandpa Clemens was of the FFVs of Virginia. Without doubt it was I that gave Susie that impression. I cannot imagine why, because I was never in my life much impressed by grandeurs which proceed from the accident of birth. I did not get this indifference from my mother. She was always strongly interested in the ancestry of the house. She traced her own line back to the Lambtons of Durham, England, a family which had been occupying broad lands there since Saxon times. I am not sure, but I think that those Lambtons got along without titles of nobility for 800 or 900 years, then produced a great man 3/4 of a century ago, and broke into the peerage. My mother knew all about the Clemenses of Virginia, and loved to aggrandize them to me, but she has long been dead. There has been no one to keep those details fresh in my memory, and they have grown dim. There was a Jerry Clemens who was a United States Senator, and in his day enjoyed the usual senatorial fame, a fame which perishes whether it spring from 4 years' service or 40. After Jerry Clemens's fame as a senator passed away, he was still remembered for many years on account of another service which he performed. He shot old John Brown's governor Wise in the hind leg in a duel. However, I am not very clear about this. It may be that Governor Wise shot him in the hind leg. However, I don't think it is important. I think that the only thing that is really important is that one of them got shot in the hind leg. It would have been better and nobler and more historical and satisfactory if both of them had got shot in the hind leg, but it is of no use for me to try to recollect history. I never had a historical mind. Let it go. Whichever way it happened, I am glad of it, and that is as much enthusiasm as I can get up for a person bearing my name. But I am forgetting the first Clemens, the one that stands furthest back towards the really original first Clemens, which was Adam. From Susy's Biography. Clara and I are sure that Papa played the trick on Grandma about the whipping. That is related in the Adventures of Tom Sawyer. "Hand me that switch." The switch hovered in the air. The peril was desperate. "My, look behind you, Aunt." The old lady whirled around and snatched her skirts out of danger. The lad fled on the instant, scrambling up the high board fence, and disappeared over it. Then Susy says, "And we know Papa played hooky all the time. And how readily would Papa pretend to be dying so as not to have to go to school?" These revelations and exposures are searching, but they are just. If I am as transparent to other people as I was to Susy, I have wasted much effort in this life. Grandma couldn't make Papa go to school, so she let him go into a printing office to learn the trade. He did so, and gradually picked up enough education to enable him to do about as well as those who were more studious in early life. It is noticeable that Susy does not get overheated when she is complimenting me, but maintains a proper judicial and biographical calm. It is noticeable also, and it is to her credit as a biographer, that she distributes compliment and criticism with a fair and even hand. My mother had a good deal of trouble with me, but I think she enjoyed it. She had none at all with my brother Henry, who was 2 years younger than I, and I think that the unbroken monotony of his goodness and truthfulness and obedience would have been a burden to her but for the relief and variety which I furnished in the other direction. I was a tonic. I was valuable to her. I never thought of it before, but now I see it. I never knew Henry to do a vicious thing toward me, or toward anyone else, but he frequently did righteous ones that cost me as heavily. It was his duty to report me, when I needed reporting, and neglected to do it myself, and he was very faithful in discharging that duty. He is Sid in Tom Sawyer, but Sid was not Henry. Henry was a very much finer and better boy than ever Sid was. It was Henry who called my mother's attention to the fact that the thread with which she had sewed my collar together to keep me from going in swimming had changed color. My mother would not have discovered it but for that, and she was manifestly piqued when she recognized that that prominent bit of circumstantial evidence had escaped her sharp eye. That detail probably added a detail to my punishment. It is human. We generally visit our shortcomings on somebody else when there is a possible excuse for it, but no matter, I took it out of Henry. There is always compensation for such as are unjustly used. I often took it out of him, sometimes as an advance payment for something which I hadn't yet done. These were occasions when the opportunity was too strong a temptation, and I had to draw on the future. I did not need to copy this idea from my mother, and probably didn't. Still, she wrought upon that principle upon occasion. If the incident of the broken sugar bowl is in Tom Sawyer, I don't remember whether it is or not, that is an example of it. Henry never stole sugar. He took it openly from the bowl. His mother knew he wouldn't take sugar when she wasn't looking, but she had her doubts about me. Not exactly doubts, either. She knew very well I would. One day, when she was not present, Henry took sugar from her prized and precious old English sugar bowl, which was an heirloom in the family, and he managed to break the bowl. It was the first time I had ever had a chance to tell anything on him, and I was inexpressibly glad. I told him I was going to tell on him, and he was not disturbed. When my mother came in and saw the bowl lying on the floor in fragments, she was speechless for a minute. I allowed that silence to work. I judged it would increase the effect. I was waiting for her to ask, "Who did that?" so that I could fetch out my news. But it was an error of calculation. When she got through with her silence, she didn't ask anything about it. She merely gave me a crack on the skull with her thimble that I felt all the way down to my heels. Then I broke out with my injured innocence, expecting to make her very sorry that she had punished the wrong one. I expected her to do something remorseful and pathetic. I told her that I was not the one, it was Henry. But there was no upheaval. She said without emotion, "It's all right, it isn't any matter. You deserve it for something you've done that I didn't know about. And if you haven't done it, why, then you deserve it for something that you are going to do that I shan't hear about." There was a stairway outside the house which led up to the rear part of the second story. One day Henry was sent on an errand, and he took a tin bucket along. I knew he would have to ascend those stairs, so I went up and locked the door on the inside, and came down into the garden, which had been newly plowed and was rich in choice firm clods of black mold. I gathered a generous equipment of these, and ambushed him. I waited till he had climbed the stairs and was near the landing and couldn't escape. Then I bombarded him with clods, which he warded off with his tin bucket the best he could, but without much success, for I was a good marksman. The clods smashing against the weatherboarding fetched my mother out to see what was the matter, and I tried to explain that I was amusing Henry. Both of them were after me in a minute, but I knew the way over that high board fence and escaped for that time. After an hour or two, when I ventured back, there was no one around, and I thought the incident was closed. But it was not. Henry was ambushing me. With an unusually competent aim for him, he landed a stone on the side of my head which raised a bump there that felt like the Matterhorn. I carried it to my mother straightway for sympathy, but she was not strongly moved. It seemed to be her idea that incidents like this would eventually reform me if I harvested enough of them. So the matter was only educational. I had had a sterner view of it than that before. It was not right to give the cat the painkiller. I realize it now. I would not repeat it in these days. But in those Tom Sawyer days it was a great and sincere satisfaction to me to see Peter perform under its influence. And if actions do speak as loud as words, he took as much interest in it as I did. It was a most detestable medicine, Perry Davis's painkiller. Mr. Pavy's negro man, who was a person of good judgment and a considerable curiosity, wanted to sample it, and I let him. It was his opinion that it was made of hellfire. Those were the cholera days of '49. The people along the Mississippi were paralyzed with fear. Those who could run away did it, and many died of fright in the flight. Fright killed 3 persons where the cholera killed 1. Those who couldn't flee kept themselves drenched with cholera preventives, and my mother chose Perry Davis's painkiller for me. She was not distressed about herself. She avoided that kind of preventive. But she made me promise to take a teaspoonful of painkiller every day. Originally it was my intention to keep the promise, but at that time I didn't know as much about painkiller as I knew after my first experiment with it. She didn't watch Henry's bottle. She could trust Henry. But she marked my bottle with a pencil, on the label, every day, and examined it to see if the teaspoonful had been removed. The floor was not carpeted. It had cracks in it, and I fed the painkiller to the cracks with very good results. No cholera occurred down below. It was upon one of these occasions that that friendly cat came waving his tail and supplicating for painkiller, which he got, and then went into those hysterics which ended with his colliding with all the furniture in the room, and finally going out of the open window and carrying the flower-pots with him, just in time for my mother to arrive and look over her glasses in petrified astonishment and say, "What in the world is the matter with Peter?" I don't remember what my explanation was, but if it is recorded in that book it may not be the right one. Whenever my conduct was of such exaggerated impropriety that my mother's extemporary punishments were inadequate, she saved the matter up for Sunday, and made me go to church Sunday night, which was a penalty sometimes bearable, perhaps, but as a rule it was not, and I avoided it for the sake of my constitution. She would never believe that I had been to church until she had applied her test. She made me tell her what the text was. That was a simple matter and caused me no trouble. I didn't have to go to church to get a text. I selected one for myself. This worked very well until one time when my text and the one furnished by a neighbor who had been to church didn't tally. After that my mother took other methods. I don't know what they were now. In those days men and boys wore rather long cloaks in the winter time. They were black and were lined with very bright and showy Scotch plaids. One winter's night, when I was starting to church to square a crime of some kind committed during the week, I hid my cloak near the gate and went off and played with the other boys until church was over. Then I returned home, but in the dark I put the cloak on wrong side out, entered the room, threw the cloak aside, and then stood the usual examination. I got along very well until the temperature of the church was mentioned. My mother said, "It must have been impossible to keep warm there on such a night." I didn't see the art of that remark, and was foolish enough to explain that I wore my cloak all the time that I was in church. She asked if I kept it on from church home, too. I didn't see the bearing of that remark. I said that that was what I had done. She said, "You wore it in church with that red Scotch plaid outside and glaring? Didn't that attract any attention?" Of course, to continue such a dialogue would have been tedious and unprofitable, and I let it go and took the consequences. That was about 1849. Tom Nash was a boy of my own age, the postmaster's son. The Mississippi was frozen across, and he and I went skating one night, probably without permission. I cannot see why we should go skating in the night unless without permission, for there could be no considerable amusement to be gotten out of skating at night if nobody was going to object to it. About midnight, when we were more than half a mile out towards the Illinois shore, we heard some ominous rumbling and grinding and crashing going on between us and the home side of the river. We knew what it meant. The ice was breaking up. We started for home pretty badly scared. We flew along at full speed whenever the moonlight sifting down between the clouds enabled us to tell which was ice and which was water. In the pauses we waited, started again whenever there was a good bridge of ice, paused again when we came to naked water, and waited in distress until a floating vast cake should bridge that place. It took us an hour to make the trip, a trip which we made in a misery of apprehension all the time. But at last we arrived within a very brief distance of the shore. We waited again. There was another place that needed bridging. All about us the ice was plunging and grinding along and piling itself up in mountains on the shore, and the dangers were increasing, not diminishing. We grew very impatient to get to solid ground, so we started too early and went springing from cake to cake. Tom made a miscalculation and fell short. He got a bitter bath, but he was so close to shore that he only had to swim a stroke or two, then his feet struck hard bottom and he crawled out. I arrived a little later without accident. We had been in a drenching perspiration, and Tom's bath was a disaster for him. He took to his bed sick, and had a procession of diseases. The closing one was scarlet fever, and he came out of it stone deaf. Within a year or two speech departed, of course, but some years later he was taught to talk, after a fashion. One couldn't always make out what it was he was trying to say. Of course he could not modulate his voice, since he couldn't hear himself talk. When he supposed he was talking low and confidentially, you could hear him in Illinois. 4 years ago, 1902, I was invited by the University of Missouri to come out there and receive the honorary degree of LL.D. I took that opportunity to spend a week in Hannibal, a city now, a village in my day. It had been 53 years since Tom Nash and I had had that adventure. When I was at the railway station ready to leave Hannibal, there was a crowd of citizens there. I saw Tom Nash approaching me across a vacant space, and I walked towards him, for I recognized him at once. He was old and white-headed, but the boy of 15 was still visible in him. He came up to me, made a trumpet of his hands at my ear, nodded his head towards the citizens, and said confidentially in a yell like a foghorn, "Same damn fools, Sam." From Susie's Biography, Papa was about 20 years old when he went on the Mississippi as a pilot. Just before he started on his trip, Grandma Clemens asked him to promise her, on the Bible, not to touch intoxicating liquors or swear, and he said, "Yes, Mother, I will," and he kept that promise 7 years when Grandma released him from it. Under the inspiring influence of that remark, what a garden of forgotten reforms rises upon my sight. Mark Twain. To be continued. End of chapter 5.